Hello, I'm Rod Grams, and welcome to the June edition of Washington Report. And once again, it's budget time in Washington, D.C., and the U.S. Senate recently passed our blueprint for the 1997 budget. We have produced a plan that will put the country on track to a balanced budget by the year 2002 and also provide tax relief for those who need it most, and that is America's working families. Later this year, the budget will proceed to the President, who I hope will sign it into law so that we can all begin to enjoy the benefits produced by a balanced budget and a lighter tax burden. Now, my guest today is Senator John Ashcroft of Missouri. Senator Ashcroft is a former governor of the state of Missouri, and I've had the pleasure of serving with him as members of the Senate's freshman class. And as a senator, he has been one of our most vocal and also dedicated advocates of term limits, a balanced budget, and tax relief. And he recently introduced the Working Americans Wage Restoration Act, which would help ease the overwhelming tax burden faced by America's working men and women. So, Senator, welcome to our Washington Report. Thank you very much for taking your time to be here.
Well, it's great to be with you, Rod, and thank you for the work you do, especially to lighten the tax burden on America's citizens. You've been a leader, especially as it relates to families. And it's time America stopped discriminating against families and at least give them a level playing field upon which to do the jobs that no country can run unless the families do those jobs.
That's right. And when we talk about our budget and balancing it by the year 2002, and we're still on course to do that with some of the reductions in spending we made last year, I think what we can really be proud about is promises we've made are promises that we're trying to keep and in passing this type of a budget. And what do you hear in Missouri about that type of an attitude?
Well, people in Missouri are very careful about the way they create their budgets at their own homes. They sit down around the kitchen table and they mark off the things they can't afford. They know that you have to make tough choices. So when they see Washington begin to respond to the budget-making process in a way that makes tough choices, they respect that. They know that the old way of doing business, just sending an order to the printing presses to print more money or to borrow more money, is as irresponsible as you can get. So Missourians are very focused on a balanced budget. They're focused on responsibility. They like the concept of governmental reform, the things to put the government under the same laws that the rest of the population. We did that last year. It was a healthy reform. They respect that. So I think people across the country are going to share those views.
Now, when we talk about balancing the budget, a lot of people think, well, that's just going to reduce spending in one area and maybe give some tax relief in another, but that's about as far as it'll go. But really, people in their own lives and in their own budgets and in the costs of doing business and the cost of buying goods or services from your stores or whatever are all going to have a dramatic and profound effect on the family budget. Interest rates, another major thing.
Oh, man.
So the prospect of balancing the budget, and this is why we talk about that the president has really delayed those benefits, go a lot farther than just trying to reduce spending in some areas.
Absolutely. One of the things that really has, the Republican budgets have protected the opportunity for student loans, for people to make investments in their not only educational future but their families' futures. But the idea, the best thing we could do for student loans is to have the kind of interest rate reductions that would come with a balanced budget. You whack a couple percentage points off student loans, you take years off the amount of time it takes people to pay back those loans. So this overall effort toward responsibility in government, well, not just on student loans, car loans, house loans. In the state of Missouri, we figure it's about $2,400 a year that home loans would be reduced if we had that kind of a reduction in the overall interest rates, which would attend a balanced budget.
So overall, I mean, the benefits would be overwhelming of really giving first responsibility or opportunity back to individuals to keep more of their money, and by that, to let them make the decisions on how to spend it, on their children's education, food, clothing, shelter, all those type of investments and securities that families really should have a first-hand decision-making process rather than sending it to Washington and then hope Washington makes those good decisions for them.
The economists all tell us that when Washington spends money, it has one impact, and when money is left in the hands of the private sector, it has another impact. What's interesting is money left in the hands of our population to spend has a growth impact on the economy generally. So that if we take money which had been governmentally spent, we say you're not spending it well, let's give it to the citizens to spend on their own families. Not only do they get to spend that money, but it grows the economy. And for America to be what America has been and what we want it to be, we have to be a growth economy. And the kinds of tax relief that you've recommended, the kind that I've fought for, the kinds of things that would put a real surge into the economy. Working Americans Wage Restoration Act, which was just to stop the double taxation on Social Security. It's an income tax you pay on the tax you send to Social Security. Wrong to have that double taxation. That would have resulted in about 500,000 new jobs, according to the economists, if we could just take that double tax off and let the American families have that resource for their own disposal.
Maybe, as long as we're talking about your tax bill, explain a little bit about what it is. And when we talk about double taxation, this is kind of prevalent in a lot of areas in our tax codes, but this one is one of the most egregious that you've addressed and tried to reform.
You know, all of us, when we get our checks, we notice that a bunch of money was taken out to pay Social Security taxes. What's not really always known to us is that not only was that tax taken out, but we paid a tax on that tax.
So it was taxed before it was taken out.
That's right. It's a tax on a tax. And what adds insult to injury there is that corporations which pay the other half of the Social Security tax, or your employer, they get a deduction. So while you get taxed twice on that money, the corporate interests or the business interests only get taxed once. Now, a lot of working Americans have thought, my goodness, why is it that the corporations get tax benefits and we don't? Well, they're right about that here. This is an area where it's unfair, it's unequal. The average guy carrying his lunch pail to work, whose wife goes to work in order to make ends meet, their kids are in a situation where they're having to struggle to get time with their parents. And one of the reasons is we've double taxed them in the face of a deduction for the business interest. It's time to bring that kind of fundamental fairness and stop double taxing the worker.
So in other words, if you get a $400 check, they tax the whole $400 first.
Yep.
And then if you got $300 left, then they take your Social Security out of that. So you've already paid tax on it, now you're paying a tax again.
That's right. And the Social Security tax that they take out was based on the $400 to begin with.
To begin with.
And you know, now that we're taxing some Social Security when it's paid as a benefit, later in life when the money comes out, you tax it again. This is the triple whammy.
Yeah.
If the right one doesn't get you, the left one will, the double whammy, and then we'll kick you on the way out the door. That's the third tax on that resource.
And by the way, and I just want to make a quick point here too, and we hear a lot of this criticism about corporate welfare or corporations or businesses getting these benefits. And these are things that Republicans for this past year and a half have been trying to provide some equity or fairness into the system. And some of the biggest complaints that I find come from some of the liberal Democrats. And to get a little partisan here, they are the ones who wrote those laws. They are the ones who provided those loopholes and traded them off to the business community. Now it's time we're trying to set the record straight, and they come back and charge us like we're the ones who did it. We know they're unequal, and we should straighten it out.
Well, you know, I think we should stop the double taxation on average people. I'm not in favor of starting double taxation on the business community. We got it right as we treated the business community. But we owe it to the people, the working people of America, to get it right as it relates to them. This proposal would put an average of, well, for the two-person working family, $1,770 a year in their pockets. And of course, that's like savings. They won't have to pay tax on that because that's something that's left over after the tax would have been paid. And to add that to the economy is what would bring literally about 10,000 jobs per state to America.
Today, people are spending about, just on the federal tax level, about 28% of their income to federal taxes. In 1950, that was 2%. So if we put this on a basis of, say, $10,000, that today, if you had $10,000, 2,800 of that, nearly 3,000 goes to the federal government, compared to just 200 in adjusted dollars since 1950. So see what people could do with that. Now you take that on a $20,000, a $30,000, a $40,000 income means you're spending $10,000 in taxes today, where you would have only spent $800. And just think what you could do with $9,200 extra in your pocket.
You know what's interesting to me? The Commerce Department recently released the data. We are now paying more in taxes as American citizens than ever before in history. So we're paying more in taxes right now than we paid to win World War II. Than we paid to spend our way out of the Great Depression. We're paying more in taxes than we paid during Vietnam or the Korean conflict. We're paying more than we paid to win the world safe for democracy. We're paying more in taxes now to government than we were when this country was fighting itself. And the truth of the matter is, paying the high rate of taxes means that for the first 3 hours of every day, you work for the government. Most folks believe that they can do a better job. Taxes take up more of the ordinary family's income than shelter, mean housing, food, and clothing combined.
And transportation thrown in.
Yeah.
John, when we talk about the tax burden, and of course Republicans have been fighting for a tax cut, including your tax plan, the cut that you provided on those type of deductions. You know, we've been pushing for the $500 per child tax credit among others. But overall, I mean, the American people are really overtaxed. And there are those out there that are saying, well, we can't afford to cut taxes now, we need to balance the budget. But then again, when we talk about the benefits, I believe we're in a position where we cannot afford not to cut taxes and give relief, again, as you said, to help spur the economy, to create new jobs and economic growth.
This is one of the sinister lies of those who want to take taxes and increase them. The 93 tax increase was the biggest tax increase in history, and they said we can sock it to the rich. Well, in a sense, they can make a tax increase that they focus on the rich. But if that kills the growth in the culture, that kills the growth in the society, everybody else's wages are flat, and all of a sudden the government has really stolen their wage increase. Incidentally, the 4+% tax increase or cent tax increase on gasoline wasn't just on the rich. It was on people who have to drive to work. It was on people who work hard on farms, have to drive into town. People in the West in particular, compared to the Northeast where they have public transit, in the West driving to work. We ended up with that so-called tax on the rich, which really taxed all of us in the Midwest and West who drive to work in order to subsidize people in the East, many of whom who refuse to work.
The feeling that seems to be among those who oppose the tax cut is that Washington can't afford to do that. In other words, they believe the money is theirs and they can't afford to give it back to you. In reality, it's your money, and we should be able to keep more of that rather than giving it all to the federal government or the state government.
According to some of the economic data, the average family has suffered about a 6.2% loss in its income capacity over the last half decade or so. So the average family's made adjustments downward. What is this sense that government can never make an adjustment, that it can never tighten its belt? How many corporations have had to tighten their belts? And in the process, made America, we're still pretty competitive. We're more competitive than we were a few years ago. It's time for some of the necessity of scarce resource to find its way to the table of government and to say, you've got to stop being ordering the top of the menu and then sending half of it to the garbage can with reckless disregard for what it costs.
What other areas can we do before we take a break here? Talk about trimming government, getting rid of some of the waste, and to make sure that government becomes more responsive. And I've always said people don't mind paying taxes if they know they're getting a benefit out of it. I mean, for roads and infrastructure and water and sewage and a clean environment and clean air and water. But what people, I think, get upset about is when they feel the federal government is wasting those dollars, and we need to restore some of that confidence.
Well, we definitely need to restore the confidence. People are willing to pay for things that they need. That's what was so good about the old gasoline taxes. They went right into roads and bridges. But the most recent increase on gasoline didn't go to roads or bridges at all. It went into social programs. And the social programs are the black hole of government. It sucks in resource and it's gone and never to be seen again. And Americans are justifiably resentful and resistant to these sort of things that had once been reasonable, that if you drive your car, you pay for gas, and part of what you pay for gas in terms of a tax goes to build the road. The more gas you burn, the more road you use, the more road you paid for. But now you drive a car and you pay for a social program. The disconnect is noticed by the American people. And whenever the people making the payments are not the people who are are consuming the benefit, we have trouble. When I go with my kids into McDonald's, if I say, whatever you want, you can buy, they load up the tray. But if I give them $5 and say, now, whatever you don't spend, you can keep, they order a pine float, a glass of water, and a toothpick, and they keep the rest. And when the people have a stake, when they know that what they're paying for is what they're going to use, they do it carefully. And we've got to start seeing that we cut out that waste by giving people a stake in what happens.
When we talk about waste, I ask people, would they give money to a charity that has 55% in overhead and administrative costs? And they say, well, definitely not. I said, that's our current welfare system, where 55 cents of every dollar is spent to administer the program. Then they begin to see
it's
the
welfare
waste.
for the bureaucrat, isn't it?
That's right.
There's more of the benefit that goes to the bureaucrat then goes to the needy person.
Yeah, and when we spend those monies to help people, we don't get all those dollars down there.
An interesting point, when I was governor of Missouri, my Medicaid director said that if we could do away with all the federal micromanagement and strings, we could extend coverage from 600,000 people to 900,000 people with the same amount of money. And as a matter of fact, that testimony doesn't come from my years as governor. It comes from the years of my successor, who is a Democrat and I'm a Republican. So it's not a partisan thing. The real fact is that the bureaucracy is a real tax on the system. It sustains itself. It deprives the resource from going to the really needy people. It consumes a large portion. It could be as much as a 50% tax on productivity, 55%, more than half of the resource spent on the bureaucracy itself.
John, we have to take a break. We'll be back and talk more with Senator John Ashcroft of Missouri right after this.
Vince, that new dummy cam is great.
Yeah, it'll sure give people a whole new outlook on what it's like when you don't wear a safety belt.
I think they'll get the picture.
You could learn a lot from a dummy. Buckle your safety belt.
He protects all living things in the forest. But he can't do it alone. Please don't play with matches. Put out your campfires. And never ever forget the words of Smokey Bear.
Only you can prevent forest fires.
And again, thank you for joining us for our Washington Report. And again, our special guest this month is Senator John Ashcroft of Missouri. And John, again, thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Being a former state governor, talking about that and bringing that experience with you to Washington, because that is so important, knowing right now and trying in our relation to de-evolutionize Washington. In other words, put more of the power, responsibility back into the hands of governors and states, which we believe can do a better job of serving their citizenry at the closest level possible. Welfare, a major issue in Medicaid and Medicare. Talking about those programs, John, is, we get a lot of complaints, or at least a lot of concerns about this idea of de-evolutionizing and putting more control back.
Well, most governors can tell you that there are things they could do far better without the intervention.
You started talking
of the
about the
federal
Medicaid
government.
program before we took a break.
Yeah, it
about
would cost us about 50% in terms of efficiency, just because we had to do it the way Washington said to do it, rather than the way it would work in Missouri. And this whole effort over the last 2 decades to have, quote, waivers, to give the states the right and ability to meet the needs of people. You'd think, isn't that a little bit of a stretch to say we have to get government out of the way, we have to waive the requirements to allow real service to happen? And I think that's really what happened to us. We've said, wait a second, if everybody wants waivers, Clinton administration brags that it's granted some kind of waiver to dozens of states. Well, the truth of the matter is, if everybody needs a waiver, why not just give states freedom to meet the needs of the people with their money and with the resources that the people have initially contributed? This idea of federal money is a good bit of a fiction. It wasn't our money to begin with. It's something the states sent in.
And the Clinton administration is talking a lot about, or was bragging, and about how it endorsed or favored the Wisconsin plan or waivers for the welfare system there, but in effect, or in reality, it had never signed that. In fact, it's still debating whether it's going to sign it. But I think that just sets up, again, the question that you just asked: why should we be granting waivers to individual states, in other words, just small parts of the puzzle or the pie, when really what the Republican plan had sent them was an overall reform of the welfare system, which would have done exactly some of the things that the waivers are asking for?
Yeah, we really want to let states make these judgments and these decisions. The idea somehow that the federal government is perfect or knows the answer. This is one of the big fallacies of Washington, the idea that Washington has the wisdom, that somehow, and I think the myth of the 60s and 70s was that Washington could figure it out and impose the answer. Then in the 80s, the idea was, well, we'll have test pilot programs and someone will discover the answer, and then we'll impose on everybody what someone discovered.
So if it works good in Mississippi, it's got to be good
Yeah.
for Missouri, Minnesota, or New England.
And the federal government will tell you so.
Yeah.
I think the revelation of the 90s that the Republic and of the next century that we're trying to put in place is that there isn't a single answer any more than there's a single size of pajamas for your family. What if you had to order one size of pajamas for your entire family? Who would be fit? One size doesn't fit all. One size fits none. No one would have a comfortable fit. No one would be efficiently served, and that's what happens when you have these great big programs run out of Washington, supervised by bureaucrats, and when they grant a waiver, it takes them, the average waiver length this year I think has been 210 days, and they demand conditions. The president says he's going to honor the plan in this state, that state, or the next state, and then Ickes or some other guy in the White House said, but they're going to have to make modifications, meaning we know better in Washington than they know at the state level. Well, we've got to reverse that. Instead of saying we know better in Washington, we've got to say, you know, this was your money in the first instance. We all care about people. We've got to trust states. After all, the election process works more directly there than it does here. And you take the money and meet the needs of the state as best you can with fundamental guidelines. But other than that, let states meet the needs of the people in the state.
And basically, that's what the 10th Amendment was all about. And people, I don't think, realize when you go from 2% of taxes to 28, how much power and control has gone from Missouri and from Minnesota to Washington. And now we have to come hat in hand, begging the federal government to give us the ability at the local level to do what's best for the residents of our state. It just seems that we've got ourselves into a catch-22, and it doesn't make much sense. And I think people are beginning to question this.
Well, there's no question about their questioning. And I think we're on the right track. When we decided to stop the mandates on states, and that was one of the first things we did in the 104th Congress, and when we've decided to stop having unlimited deficits to displace to the next generation the cost of doing business, and we're going to say to states now, if we can, and that's the block grant theory, we want to give you the opportunity to meet needs efficiently and effectively. And whenever resources are scarce, and indeed they are, and we ought to make sure government resources are, because that leaves more in the hands of people when we do. When those resources are scarce, we ought to make sure we get the most for our money. And one size fits all doesn't get that job done.
All right. John, we're going to take another break. We'll be back and talk more with Senator John Ashcroft of Missouri about other issues facing us here in the Senate in these coming weeks right after this.
Your approach is looking good, Cobra.
The men and women in the National Guard and Reserve face some tough challenges when they serve. Challenges that teach them discipline, leadership, and technical skills that make them better employees. So when they need time off to serve, don't make their toughest challenge approaching you.
My hero? Isaiah Thomas. Kevin Costner. Mr. Wong.
These are teachers, but to the kids they've reached, they're heroes.
My hero? Mrs. Wooten. If I don't get through to that child, who knows, maybe no one else will.
Teachers have the power to wake up young minds, to be heroes, to make a difference. Reach for that power. Teach. Find out how by calling 1-800-45-TEACH. Be a teacher. Be a hero.
And again, our special guest is Senator John Ashcroft of Missouri. Again, John, thank you very much for being with us. And when we talk about John being one of our vocalist members of the freshman class and in the Senate on a lot of the reform issues, and we got to add a little bit to the vocal part of it, because John is also part of the vocal majority, which is 4 members of the Senate that are doing a great job in some of the entertainment and doing some of the singing. And John is a great singer among everything else, and along with Trent Lott, Jim Jeffers, Larry Craig of Idaho, and John Ashcroft. So we have a lot of talent here in the Senate besides a lot of other things, John. One of the things that John has been very vocal on, besides the music, but back into legislation, is term limits. And you know, 70-80% of the American people say we should have term limits. It's an idea whose time has really come to get into effect.
Sure is. 41 governors. I mean, there's 80% of the governors are term limited. I was term limited as governor. I'm one of the people that's been term limited. It's a good thing. The American people have tried it. The think tanks are confused about it. They can't make it work in theory, but the American people have made it work for hundreds of years in practice. We've had it for presidents since the early 50s. Well, we've really had it for presidents, for every president except FDR. And George Washington sort of established the concept when he said we should be different from the kings who serve for life.
That's right.
We ought to have a different system over here. And he walked away after 2 terms. So did Jefferson. So did all the great presidents.
You've also put it on your homepage, put it into the computer, asking the question. What kind of response did you get from, across Missouri, but across from the country?
Well, we really got a worldwide response. When you're on the internet, you have people everywhere. We had about 50,000 people visit the Term Limits homepage in a 2-week interval before the vote. And we had the second vote in history on congressional term limits. In 1947, there was 1 vote in favor of them. We got 58 votes for cloture on the issue this year. We're making real progress, but the American people know that people who identify with the institution instead of with the community, with the Congress instead of with their county and city, vote differently. And people want us to represent them, knowing we're going to move back, knowing we're going to be a part of the community. And so they want, and justifiably so, expect term limits, and we'll keep working for it.
And we should add this too, that when we're voting on term limits, all we're trying to do is to let the states decide. We're not deciding the issue. All we're blocking is the state's ability to decide it, and we'd really like to just get it out of Congress and say, okay, Minnesota, Missouri, and the other 48 states, you decide whether you want term limits or not, and we'll abide by that, but we shouldn't impose it on there. John, in just the few short moments we have, term limits would have made a big difference in many different ways on things that were passed and things that weren't passed.
We'd have had a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, according to the Cato Institute, 3 times already in this decade if we'd have been using term-limited type people who vote differently in earlier years of their service than in later years. And we would have had the line item veto in 85 instead of in 95, 96. What's interesting is those Democrat-sponsored tax increases on the people would not have passed, nor would those Democrat-sponsored, conjured up pay increases for the Congress. So we would have had the good reforms. We would not have had tax increases nor the pay increases that the Democrats sponsored for Congress.
Now, we could go on for a long time, John. We're out of time. I want to thank you again and appreciate you taking your time to be with us.
Keep up your good work.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us on Washington Report. We'll see you next month.